Hello, welcome everybody. Good day. Welcome to our webinar about the developments and trends in the European fish and seafood market. This webinar is organized by CBI, the Center for the Promotion of Imports from Developing Countries. We are part of the Netherlands Enterprise Agency and funded mainly by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Through our projects, we support the transition to sustainable and inclusive economies by helping SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to export, among others, to Europe. My name is Sanne Bogers and I'm a Program Manager Market Intelligence at CBI, and I'm responsible for the fish and seafood sector. CBI offers market intelligence on the European market for 14 different sectors, ranging from fish and seafood to grains, pulses and oilseeds, and to IT outsourcing. Our market intelligence is specifically aimed at exporters from developing countries. It is free and contains a lot of tips on how to best enter the European market. For the fish and seafood sector, our market research is conducted by Seafood Tip. Today, our market researchers Mariska Bottema and Sophia Balod will present to you the key findings of our market statistics and outlook study and our trend study. This webinar will take about 75 minutes. After the introduction of the speakers, Mariska will start with giving you an insight of the demand and how this has evolved during the pandemic. After about 20 minutes, there is a possibility for you as an audience to ask questions. Then Sophia will guide you through the trends that we see on the market. Then again, we have time for questions that our market researchers will try to answer. At the end of the webinar, I will give you some more information about the market intelligence that we offer. Some practical aspects about this webinar. We cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions or remarks, please put them in the question or chat box. Also, if you have technical questions, please put them there. This webinar is recorded and will be published on our website so that you can watch it again or share it with others who might be interested. The presentation will also be sent to you a couple of days after the webinar. If you have any audio problems, please try phone call among the audio options. The tariff should be toll-free or local. And lastly, we kindly request you to fill a short survey at the end of this webinar. It is important for us to receive feedback in order to improve our future webinars. Well, I hope it will work for everyone. I will now give the floor to Mariska and Sophia for their introduction. I wish you all a very interesting and useful webinar.
Thank you for the introduction, Sanne. My name is Mariska Bottema. I'm very happy to be here today. Today, my colleague Sophia Balod and I will present this webinar. Sophia and I are both analysts at Seafood Tip, and Seafood Tip is a member-based platform. We provide intelligence on the seafood supply chain to our members, and our aim is to increase transparency within the sector, enabling organizations to make more sustainable and more profitable sourcing and purchasing decisions. In this presentation, I will present the demand for seafood on the European market, and Sophia will follow me with a presentation of a number of key trends that offer opportunities or pose threats to the European seafood market. So the European seafood market remained relatively stable in 2020. The value of total imports fell by only about 1%. Now, Europe is the world's largest seafood importer from developing countries. As you can see in the graph, in 2020, Europe's import value was the highest, importing 14.4 billion worth of imports from developing countries. The US imported 13.1 billion, Japan and China imported 7.2 and 6.2 billion respectively. This illustrates that Europe is a key market for seafood from developing countries. Now, despite the impacts of COVID-19 on both seafood supplying countries and on European markets, Europe continues to be a major market for seafood from developing countries. In 2020, imports from developing countries were 8% less than they were in 2019. It's important to understand that Europe imports seafood for consumption, but also for further processing and re-export. It also hosts major trade hubs for distributing products in the region. The European seafood market should not be mistaken for one single market. Europe is actually made up of a diverse group of countries with separate but interrelated markets. The European seafood market is usually divided into three main regions: Southern, Northwestern, and Eastern Europe. Now, your success in Europe depends on understanding the needs of these different target markets. Let's start with Southern Europe. Southern Europe represents the biggest opportunity for exporting your seafood products to Europe. Southern Europe's imports from developing countries make up 58% of total European imports from developing countries. Furthermore, Europe's top three importing nations, Spain, Italy, and France, are located in Southern Europe. Now, this block of countries do not only have the highest seafood consumption rates, but Spain, Italy, and France are also Europe's major processing nations. So a lot of the seafood is processed in these countries. The three product categories that dominate imports from developing countries in Southern Europe are crustaceans, so mainly shrimp, mollusks such as squid and cuttlefish, and prepared and preserved fish, which include canned and pre-packed products. Now we move to Northwestern Europe. Northwestern Europe represents another interesting export opportunity for you. It imports 35% of total European imports from developing countries. This region hosts three major trade hubs and re-exports a lot of seafood as well. So the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium are actually Europe's major seafood trade hubs, and they're located in Northwestern Europe. Thanks to their strategic locations in Europe and port cities like Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Antwerp, these countries act as a gateway to the rest of Europe. Northwestern Europe mainly imports fish fillets, so pangasius and reef fish, crustaceans, again, mainly shrimp, and prepared and preserved fish from developing countries. Lastly, I'll talk about Eastern Europe. Though Eastern Europe imports a mere 3% of total European imports from developing countries, seafood imports to Eastern Europe have steadily been increasing since 2015. However, opportunities for exporting your seafood products to Eastern Europe are not very high, as Eastern Europe does not spend a lot of money on exotic seafood. Eastern Europe mainly imports fish fillets, so Alaskan pollock and hake, prepared and preserved fish, and crustaceans, again mainly shrimp, from developing countries. Now I'm going to talk about sustainable seafood, because this is an upcoming trend and is important to spend a little time talking about. The demand for sustainable seafood is actually on the rise in all of the three European markets I just described. Europe has always been a key market for sustainable seafood. Companies in Northern Europe and North America actually began making commitments to source sustainable seafood in the early 2000s. And these commitments have actually expanded globally over time. Europe is home to the biggest concentration of certified products, and according to a global benchmark made by the Seafood Certification and Ratings Collaboration, in 2019, more than 20,000 seafood products in Europe were certified and labeled. The Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative, referred to as GSSI, developed a global benchmark tool that provides formal recognition of seafood certification schemes that successfully complete a rigorous and transparent benchmark process, which is underpinned by the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. Now, as a result of actually the existence and then the work of GSSI, we see a gradual shift from retailers committing to selling seafood with specific eco-labels, such as the Aquaculture Stewardship Council and Marine Stewardship Council. We see a shift to retailers committing to selling seafood which is certified by any GSSI benchmark standards. And these include standards such as best aquaculture practices and global GAP. You can read more about this in our fact sheet on sustainability, which will be published later this year. Now, for a long time, the trend of retailers making commitments to source sustainable seafood was really something limited to Northwestern Europe and the Nordic countries. However, in recent years, sustainable seafood also seems to be on the rise in Southern and Eastern Europe. The total growth of MSC certified seafood sold in 2000 was actually mainly accounted for by Southern Europe. As shown in the graph, the number of MSC certified products on the Southern European market increased by 31% in 2020 when compared to the previous year. The amount of ASC certified products on offer in Southern Europe grew by 46% in 2020. You can find more details on this development if you look at the Outlook study. Now it's time for a poll question. Sanne? Since Sanne's not jumping in here, I'm going to pose the poll question. The question we're asking you is, for which region do you think imports from developing countries have reduced the most during COVID-19? Is that Northwestern Europe? Is that Southern Europe? Or is that Eastern Europe? Please take some time to fill in your answer to this poll question.
Thank you for posing the question, Mariska. Sorry I wasn't able to do so. I see 71% of our audience has now voted. So I think we can close the poll and show the results. Are you discussing the results, Mariska?
Sure. So I see that the majority of people answered Eastern Europe. Before I tell you what the answer is, this is a really important question to ask, of course, because the Outlook study aims to inform you about how COVID-19 affected your markets and their seafood imports. And I can tell you that the majority actually voted correctly. Imports to Eastern Europe dropped the most in 2020. In this year, Eastern Europe imported $435 million from worth of imports from developing countries. This was a drop of 24%, so by far the biggest drop in imports when compared to Southern and Northwestern Europe. In Northwestern Europe, import values from developing countries in 2020 actually increased by 2% to reach 5 billion. But I'll talk about Northwestern Europe a little bit later. The total value of Southern Europe seafood imports from developing countries dropped by about 12%. And this is particularly relevant because Southern Europe is the biggest importer of seafood from developing countries, which I'm now going to discuss in the next slide. Okay, so Southern Europe is still Europe's biggest seafood lover, despite what happened with COVID. Southern Europe consists of countries along the Mediterranean Sea. The total value of Southern Europe's seafood imports from developing countries in 2020 was $8.3 billion. Like I said, this was a 12% drop from 2019. Southern Europe's imports from developing countries represent about 82% of Southern Europe's imports from outside of Europe. This indicates that the majority of imported seafood to this region comes from developing countries. Now, if we look at changes in import values of major product categories, the imported value of crustaceans decreased by 9%. The import value of mollusks decreased by about 19%, and the import value of prepared and preserved fish fell by 9% in 2020. Southern European countries were hit hard by COVID-19. According to the European Commission's European Economic Forecast Winter 2021, whilst some member states are expected to see their GDP levels reach pre-crisis levels by the end of this year, particularly Spain and Italy are actually forecasted to take longer because of the hits they took because of COVID-19. Now, in the Southern European seafood sector, COVID-19's negative impact is particularly apparent in their processing sector. This sector was faced with significant challenges, such as those associated with implementing measures to establish safe working conditions to avoid the spread of COVID-19 amongst workers. Some businesses, unfortunately, have had to close down. That said, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Many measures have been lifted and business has been resumed in most cases. Furthermore, as the food service has reopened and tourism is getting back on track, consumption and demand in Southern Europe is increasing again. Now we're going to talk about Northwestern Europe. In 2020, Northwestern Europe imported $5 billion US dollars worth of seafood from developing countries. Unlike Southern Europe, import values in 2020 actually increased by 2%. In this region, imports from developing countries represent 74% of Northwestern Europe's total imports from outside of Europe. So also quite a significant percentage. Now, if we look at the import value of the three product groups that dominate imports from developing countries, the import value of fish fillets during 2020 fell by 12%, but the value of crustaceans rose by 9%, and imports of prepared and preserved fish actually increased by 17%. This is painting a very different picture than Southern Europe. Though COVID-19 hit Northwestern Europe's seafood industry with its many traders and processors, something notable happened in this region. Demand for seafood clearly shifted from food service to the retail industry. And as a result, overall imports from developing countries have not decreased a lot, and there has been a shift in demand to value-added products. It will be interesting to see how the dynamics of demand from the food service sector and retail sector change this coming year, as the food sector has reopened and whether demand for value-added products remains a permanent characteristic of this market. Now, after this brief reflection on the European seafood market in 2020, I will now provide you with an outlook for the coming months. The vaccination rate in Europe is high. Some measures are still in place, with certain sectors still working from home, for example. But overall, things have opened up and business is being resumed. Over the past months, the food sector has reopened in all of Europe. Regulations in the sector are still in place, but are decreasing steadily, and in some countries will be removed entirely for people that are vaccinated. Travel in Europe is relatively easy at the moment. Europeans traveled throughout the whole summer, and tourism is recovering in specific areas. So demand for seafood from the tourism sector is expected to grow. Retail demand remains strong, as does demand for value-added products. Adding value to your seafood products and exporting these, therefore, provides a large opportunity, but more on that later. Supply logistics within Europe are back on track, with eased travel restrictions for all modes of transport. With flights resuming, fresh products are more easily brought into Europe again. However, logistics around transporting frozen products from Asia in particular remains a challenge. This is due to the global shortage of containers and high freight rates. It is unclear how long this will remain a problem, and it's something to keep in mind. overall the economy in Europe is getting back on track sooner than expected. At the same time, there are also longer-term trends that are relevant to your business. And Sophia is going to continue with these a bit later. First of all, let's do another poll question. Sanne, go ahead.
Okay, Mariska, I'm going to launch the next poll. And the question is, which products do you as an audience trade in? Is that fresh or value added or raw materials for processing, or is that multiple products? Please vote. I see about half of our audience has voted, so give it a bit more time. We are curious to know which products you trade in. A few seconds, I will close the poll. And I will share the results. Mariska, do you take it from here again?
Sure. So I see that the majority of answers are that the audience trades in multiple products. So not just fresh, not just value added, and not just raw materials, but multiple products. Interesting. Well, we asked this question because the next section is about which specific seafood products coming from CBI countries have the most potential on the European market. And I think what I'm going to tell you has a relevance for people trading in fresh products, value-added products, and raw material products for processing. So I will continue with the presentation now. So in the table, you see a list of key seafood products imported to Europe from developing countries. On the left column, you see the import values of products imported from developing countries. And on the right column, you see import values of products imported specifically from CBI project countries. Please note that in the table, you see HS4 codes. If you want to see HS6 codes and more detailed information, please refer to the full Outlook and statistics study that we made. Now, based on these values, which show us which products were being supplied by CBI countries between 2016 and 2019, and our knowledge of market demand in Europe, we can make several conclusions about which products have the most potential on the European market. So over the years, the demand for convenience products in Europe has seen a strong growth, particularly for products that are quick and easy to prepare. During the pandemic, this demand has become even stronger as more people turn to home cooking amid the closure of the food service sector. Retail demand, as we mentioned before, is likely here to stay. Therefore, as an exporter, providing direct products for this market can provide you with a good opportunity to supply to the retail sector. Value-added products present an interesting opportunity. In 2020, prepared and preserved shrimp represented about 18% of Europe's total warm water shrimp imports. Imports of prepared and preserved shrimp from developing countries have seen an annual growth of 2% per year. The annual growth from CBI countries is 5%. Therefore, adding value to your shrimp products can offer you a good position on the European shrimp market, as the demand for this product is growing. An example of adding value to shrimp is offering cooked peeled products instead of head-on shell-on shrimp. Canned fish provide another interesting opportunity. The COVID-19 pandemic has also led to increased European consumption of canned fish. As retail became the main outlet for fish and seafood, the demand for canned fish increased, especially during the period of the lockdown. And this reinforced the trend that European consumers want simple, ready-to-eat, and convenient seafood. Prepared and preserved fish products to the EU have been growing with a yearly rate of 6% between 2016 and 2019. And within this group, prepared and preserved tuna saw a growth of 7.5%. However, the import value from CBI countries actually diminished with 2% over these years. However, despite this slight drop, the growing demand and consumption of these products during 2020 suggests that these products provide significant opportunities for you as an exporter to enter this market. Now, if processing your products within your own company or your own country is not possible, you can also supply raw material for the European processing industry. The value of frozen fish imported from developing countries has increased by 2% between 2016 and 2019. These products include a wide range of species, including tuna, sardines, and anchovies. And when we focus on CBI countries, we see a growth of 3% for frozen anchovies and 8% for frozen sardines. These are canned in Europe. Large canneries and processing companies are based in Spain and France, and exporting your product to these countries can thus provide you with an opportunity if you are not able to directly produce canned products yourself. And lastly, next to supplying these products groups, there are also some opportunities in supplying fresh products to niche markets and the food service segment. For fish fillets, we see a positive growth of 4% for imports from all developing countries and a 9% growth for CBI countries. A distinctive product in this category is swordfish. In 2020, the import value of swordfish reached almost $27 million US. Over the period of 2016 to 2019, swordfish products saw a growth of 17%, and the main contributor for this growth were fresh fillets. These fillets saw a growth of 54% for CBI countries. Now, the majority of fresh swordfish purchases goes to the food service sector in Northwestern Europe and is served in the high-end food service sector and cruise industry. With air transportation operational again and the tourism sector picking up, there are opportunities to export this product. However, it is important to say that do keep in mind that the sustainability of the specific species might be questioned by buyers. So just to conclude, overall, we can see that despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the European market continues to be a market full of opportunity for developing country exporters. After the question and answer session now, Sophia will take over from me and she's going to present the trends that offer opportunities or pose threats to the European seafood market.
Thank you very much, Mariska. As you already announced, we now have some time for questions and answers from the audience about this part on market statistics and outlook. So if you have any questions, please put them in the question or chat. So I already saw a few questions coming in. Let me have a look. Let me see. Okay, so one of the questions is, can you tell a bit more about the effect of Brexit on the European seafood markets?
Yes, that's a very good question. So one of the big effects we currently see are the problems with trade between the EU mainland and the UK. And as a result, we've seen that the UK will source more products directly themselves as a result of Brexit. With Brexit in place since the beginning of 2020, statistics actually show us that direct imports into the UK from developing countries increased by 9% over the third quarter and 6% over the fourth quarter of 2020. So for you as an exporter, it is important to notice that registration systems for imports and regulation might change over the coming time. However, we foresee that food legislation will probably not differ too much from European food legislation.
Thank you very much, Mariska. Some more questions are coming in. Can you say something about the outlook for frozen tuna, ready to cook, like steaks?
Yeah.
Oh, I hear some echo.
There's the feedback.
Maybe Mariska should put off her microphone while Sophia is speaking. Maybe that helps.
Is it okay? Yes. Yeah, for the frozen tuna, as we have mentioned earlier,
I cannot hear you at this moment, Sophia. Trying to fix this.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. As Mariska has mentioned earlier, the demand for frozen products will continue, but it really depends where you're sourcing it from. So maybe indeed, like as we have mentioned earlier, with Asia, there are still problems for logistics, but the demand will continue. And your question about the steak, so those are ready to cook steak fillets, for example, frozen tuna fillets, that will continue, and the demand will actually also increase, especially for those that are pre-cut or those that are already pre-packaged. So for example, if you're already dealing with a European buyer, then it's good to have the requirements coming from them as well. So for example, if they are interested in specific cuts, especially for tuna steaks, cuts that are more easy to prepare or parts that are more easy to be packed or prepared by consumers, then indeed that will become in demand.
Thank you. One of the other questions is about the opportunities for companies engaged in fisheries to set up joint ventures in the Asian region for farmed fish. So if I understand the question correctly, it's moving from fisheries to farming, and then how are the opportunities for exporting to Europe?
What are the opportunities for companies engaged in fisheries to set up joint ventures in the Asian regions for farmed fish? Is that correct, Sana?
Yes, yes.
Actually, I think for this question, I think we should ask the audience to have a little bit of patience, because in the trends, the last trend that Sophia is going to describe is actually about mergers and acquisitions, and how we see this trend developing and what that means for exports, for exporters from developing countries.
Okay, I think the audience can have a bit more patience then for the answer. Then you already mentioned sustainable fish. Can you say something about the outlook for sustainable fish, so certified sustainable fish? Do you see it becomes compulsory for the European market?
Yeah, this is something that many people ask, and I think you get what it looks like is that for Northwestern Europe, it's more quickly becoming a standard requirement for the retail sector. And for the processing sector and for the food service sector, it's not yet a compulsory requirement for seafood that is imported, although that's actually changing. That's also something that Sophia will speak about. But if you look overall, the importers that we speak to have suggested that in the next couple of years, it looks like this is going to become a requirement for the whole of Europe. They see more and more of these requirements in Southern Europe as well, and also in Eastern Europe. but it's difficult to foresee when it's going to become a permanent requirement in the whole of Europe. Because of course, in the end, it depends where the seafood is going to. For retail, for sure, that's going to happen. But for the other sectors, that's difficult to say exactly.
Thank you very much. Can you also say something about processing? Is the processing sector a good way to gain market access in the European Union?
I can talk about that. Yes, because as we mentioned in the presentation, if you're unable to directly add value in the origin of country, then sending raw materials to the European Union can be a good first step to gain that access. And that is especially true, for example, in Southern Europe, where there is a lot of processing companies present, and they really import raw material for further processing. And that's, for example, in canned fish, or in other pre-packed and already preserved products. Processors are actually used to work with bulk products, which can make initial investments needed at your facility less. And however, you need to remember that food safety regulations are important in this regard, and you need to also secure the necessary permits that are required by the European Union. And if you go to the fact sheet of CBI on the on the canned fish, that is where, and also in the tuna loin, so that is actually one of the biggest raw materials that the Southern European especially import. So you can also take a look at the CBI studies that we have further written. Check it out. So that's frozen tuna loin. So that's a raw material for canned fish, and also the canned fish fact sheet.
Thank you, Sophia. And indeed, at the end of this webinar, we will look at the studies that we have, CBI, and that you can access and find more information. I see we have a couple of more questions. I'm afraid we have to move on with the second part of the presentation, but maybe we can try to answer them at the end, or we could answer them after the webinar by email, for example. So then I would like to give the floor to Sophia again for your part of the presentation.
Okay, so thank you, Mariska, for that presentation. And now I'm actually going to discuss about the trends that offer opportunities and also pose threats to the European market. Okay, so as Mariska has mentioned during her presentation on the outlook, during COVID-19, learning to adapt to the new normal, especially during the pandemic, is essential to the success in the European and seafood market. And in this presentation, I'm going to discuss some key trends that you as an exporter can follow and should focus on. So now we move to the first trend that is very important, and that is the increased home consumption of pre-packed fish products. So in this particular trend, convenience and food safety are the main drivers. And due to COVID-19, people are also less likely to buy, for example, in open fish counters, or for example, out in the market because they are in quarantine, or because of movement restrictions imposed in their countries. And thus, pre-packed products that are available in the retail, or for example, those that you can order online, are seen as more in demand. They're also seen as more, for example, safe or hygienic instead of buying them in the open fish counters. Demand also increases for the younger population, especially those who do not want to prepare their fish dishes and are looking for more convenient ways to cook their fish. Especially during the pandemic period, people are, cooped or locked down in their homes, and therefore they want to experience or experiment in more cooking, and they want something that is less of a hassle. And that being said, during COVID-19, retail sales actually went up, and demand increased for sales for pre-packed items and other value-added products. So what Mariska also has mentioned, there's an increase for canned fish products, for example, products that are in pouches, products that are sold in pre-packed, and therefore formats and product requirements may change if you are already exporting to Europe. You can see, for example, maybe that your buyer is asking you for different requirements, for example, for raw material, and that could mean that you can have a different cut requirement, different size requirement, different colors, for example, or different packaging or different requirement. And that was also related to the question earlier about the frozen tuna steak. So that could be indeed like something that could be in demand. So that's something, for example, a steak that is a different cut, more easily presented in the retail sector, for example. So that's something that you need to contact your buyer to know what they actually want or what is in demand. So you as an exporter, it's better to also have an understanding of the pre-pack options for your products that are ready to use for European households. And in addition to that, as I've said, that there's a lot of people experimenting with their cooking, and therefore you can also provide, like unique ethnic recipes for your products to help consumers try different tastes or prepare their dish differently at home. Value addition is key if you want to expand your reach and market, especially in the retail sector, which is, of course, very in demand at the moment. All right. The next trend that I'm going to discuss is the consumer distrust and how we can actually solve it. So as consumers demand more assurance, there are different ways to actually give assurance to your buyer and also to the consumers. At the moment, because of the pandemic, consumers have an increased awareness of the seafood they eat, and not just during the pandemic. It is a trend that continues to evolve. They are more in touch, or they are more in connection with the food they eat, the food they put in their bodies, where it comes, where it is sourced from, or who produced it. And therefore, in the media especially, or in reports that provoke distrust, this comes, for example, from food safety issues such as the use of antibiotics, or bad working environments for the people who work in the seafood industry, human rights issues, for example, that are linked to slavery or social welfare. So how can you actually dissolve this distrust, or how can you solve this issue? There are two ways that you can do it. First is seafood traceability, and the second is sustainability. First, we go to seafood traceability. This is actually a growing political trend in Europe, and you can see it on how the European Union and European Commission also formulates their policies and laws around traceability and sustainability. Traceability is a key factor to assure transparency within all the parts of supply chain. As you can see here in this photo in the presentation, the supply chain is the whole supply chain is included, and tracking or tracing from the farmer level, the farm to fork for those that are produced in aquaculture, or from sea to plate, for example, those that are produced in the wild. Those are very important for the consumers. And this can be done through different methods. So you could opt for the DNA traceback technology, which uses the DNA of the seafood in order to track where they come from, which farm they were sourced. Or, for example, the blockchain technology, which is also used, for example, not just in aquaculture, but especially in the fishery sector. So there are many ways in order for your product to be traced. And you can look at the digitalization study that is actually now published on the CBI website to know more about these different technologies and how you can apply them to your business. Next is the sustainability certifications. So Mariska has already touched on it earlier, but in this section, I really wanted to emphasize that a certification is key if you want to expand your market and also your reach, especially in Europe. They are most especially sought after in the European retail sector and are also increasingly requested in other segments such as the food service or in the processing sector. So, for example, in the processing sector, those that supply the frozen tuna loins, for example, you have an edge if you have an MSC certification, because then the raw material use for the processing sector is already MSC certified, for example. So those are the things that are actually now being applied in the European processing sector. And for the food service, for example, if, for example, a food service provider or like a big hotel group uses certified products, then other companies will also follow, because if they want to remain competitive in this market, then it is also good to have their products already certified. While this is not yet a requirement, we see that this is something that's continuously going to become more prominent or more in demand in the European sector. All right. The next trend that I'm going to discuss is also linked to the previous slide, which is all about making sure that your consumers trust your product. And the next trend will be about storytelling, or what is actually the story behind your product. So if an importer asks you, okay, so tell me, what is your story? What would you have to say? Normally, you already mentioned during in an offer, for example, to a European buyer, the answers to who, what, when, where. These are all the basic questions that an exporter would answer in their offer. But answering also, for example, the whys and hows and the impact of your product, those are questions that also equally matter in the European food sector. And importers are continuously looking for your USP, or the unique selling point. Consumers have an appetite for authentic, healthy, and sustainable products. And in a crowded marketplace, your story will allow you to attract more consumers to your products and increase your margins. Once you know your story, so if it's about traceability or sustainability, or the way you deal with people working in the fish sector, or the farmers in the ponds for shrimp, be sure to be able to tell it. So it's not enough that you have a story. You have to communicate it. You have to be visible, and whether that's on your packaging, in the way you present your products, in the marketing materials, or even on Facebook or LinkedIn, online visibility, those are very important to be able to tell a story. If you see on the slide, you actually have some examples. These are also, by the way, in the fact sheet that we made for CBI, but those are nice examples on how your storytelling can actually reach more audience. So, for example, the fish tails, that is a canned fish product available that is headquartered in Netherlands. They source from the one-on-one fishing from Indonesia and Maldives for tuna. So that is the story they want to tell in their canned fish products, that they say, oh, okay, these are actually caught sustainably in the seas of Maldives or in the seas of Indonesia. And to the right are actually seaweed farmers. So what they do is collect the seaweed that are otherwise thrown in the ocean, for example, and then make a living out of it, and the companies that provide livelihood for these Filipino women actually use this as a tool to share that they are doing their social responsibility for the seaweed exports. And in the below it is, of course, I think a lot of people know, is the SSP. So that is from Ecuador. So they do a lot of on sustainability and also traceability. And here you can actually see that their products can be traced from its origin. And the same is true for Aquamaya, and that's from Guatemala. So the shrimp there, for example, they attach it to images of volcanoes or images of people who work in shrimp farms. And they even have a mascot. This mascot is the shrimp ninja. So there's the woman empowerment there. So this mascot helps demystify sort of the farming practices in Guatemala, and allows consumers to actually share these products for the consumers. All right. Okay, so next one. Lastly, as I've mentioned earlier, as we have talked earlier in the previous presentation of Mariska, is the rapid consolidations of companies through mergers and acquisitions. Yes, strategic buyers purchase distribution companies that sell to wholesale and retail markets, and thus expanding their reach and channels. Mergers and acquisitions can lead to expansion of product portfolio, get new buyers, and most importantly, especially during this time of uncertainty, is the security of raw materials. And at the moment, now that we are, moving forward after the pandemic, why do we think that the time is right for mergers and acquisition? Well, first, due to the impact of pandemic, a lot of smaller companies are struggling and therefore are likely to be acquired by bigger companies. Mergers bigger companies are looking for smaller companies to acquire, to increase their portfolio or to expand their reach. And at the moment, there's also access to cheap finance. So likely other bigger companies are more encouraged to buy or acquire new companies. Financial investors are likely to focus on the processing sector to of course, have that security in raw material, and also gain access to retail. And that retail sector is now the key, especially in the European sector, as we have discussed earlier, to the European market. What is an example of that merger and acquisition? So like in the past years, if you know Maruha Nichiro, it's the world's biggest seafood company. They have purchased Seafood Connection to get better access to the European market. And recently, through Seafood Connection, they made recent acquisitions such as the Anova Seafood in the Netherlands and Inlet Seafish in Spain in 2019. So expanding their reach and expanding the countries they are present in, acquiring materials that are, for example, otherwise hard to get because they just don't have the connection. These are done more easily when there is a rapid consolidation between companies. So yes, so those are the major trends that we see are going to be likely be present in the European seafood market. All right, so now we go to the exciting part, which is the question and answer. So if you have other questions regarding the trends and also from the outlook, you may now type it in the questions.
Yes, thank you. I received a couple of questions, but I understood from my co-organizers that they received even more. So we have to look how we can answer them all. One of the questions that came in already earlier is, can you say anything if there's any preference for catched fish, so wild fish, versus farmed fish in Europe? And does this change between regions?
Yes, I think it really depends on the because it really depends on the region or the European country that you want to focus on. So, for example, in Southern Europe, where they are really big fish eaters, they are more accustomed to eating a lot more fish and therefore a lot more variety, for example, of wild fish and other seafood products. It also depends, for example, to the importer, because usually importers in Europe focus on several products. So they have a portfolio of wild fish products and also farmed products. So it really depends on the country and also the importer. And usually importers handle both. So, for example, if you have a focus on wild species, then you can better present your wild fish products. But and if you have farm species that you are focusing in, then there is also an importer for that. So yeah, I think there are quite some differences in that. But also it's good if you go to the CBI website, because there we have outlined the opportunities for wild species versus farm species. So if you're, for example, exporting, say, tuna or wild farmed pangasius, then you can check out the CBI website for the opportunities for your products, because it really is dependent on the importing nation and also which importers you're already in contact with. Yes.
Thank you, Sophia. Then a question about the sustainability requirements. Are there also retailers and food service sectors referring to the seafood guides, such as the Seafood Fishwijzer? So it's by the Good Fish Foundation or the Worldwide Nature Fund, or to find sustainability initiatives as an alternative to high-cost certification schemes.
Yeah,
so maybe you can tell a little bit first about this Fishwijzer, and then because I'm not sure if it's familiar for everyone.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in the fact sheet that we're currently developing about sustainability certification, we're going to talk about this in great detail, so you can look forward to that. But the Viswijzer, this is like a Dutch NGO that gives advice on what type of fish are sustainably or responsibly produced and which type of fish are better avoided. And the UK also has a similar organization who does that, as do perhaps other countries in Europe. Now, what you also have is improvement projects. And what you have with certain types of species that have not yet been certified, you find retailers are sourcing from, because there's no certified fish, they start sourcing from improvement projects. And improvement projects are projects that can prove that they are taking steps towards improvement. And what you have is you have Fishery Progress is an organization that gives you a range of information about global fisheries improvement projects. And similarly, you have the APE directory, the Aquaculture Improvement Project Directory, which gives you information about different aquaculture improvement projects that are out there. And basically what you're finding now is if you search the web and you look at the different type of sourcing commitments that retailers are making, I cannot give you one specific way they do it. Some retailers are still saying they only source seafood from Marine Stewardship Council or Aquaculture Stewardship Council or other certification schemes. But there's also a lot of retailers that are now saying we're sourcing from any certification schemes which have been benchmarked by the global steward, by the GSSI. And what you find in actually all of these sourcing commitments is that they say if a seafood species is not yet certified, then we look at improvement projects. There's also retailers that ask research institutes to verify that these projects are actually acting responsibly. So it really differs per retailer.
Thank you very much, Mariska, for answering this question. So we talked a lot about sustainability already. I would like to pose one of the questions about traceability. So is there any preference from consumers from a kind of traceability system, for a kind of traceability system?
This is hard to say because there are many different options, and it is mostly, of course, related to the supply chain. But I think, for example, in the canned fish sector, they mostly use the blockchain technology. And then for some aquaculture products, like for example, like for shrimp, they're already using the DNA Tracepacked technology. So it depends really per species and what kind of supply chain you have. So for example, the DNA Tracepacked, you can only do it mostly if you are a vertically integrated company. So if you have if you control also the production processes. So yeah, it's difficult to say that, but maybe best is to read our digitalization study. That's also available on CBI, and Seafood Tip also developed that. And there you can also see what kind of options you have depending on the supply chain that best fits your company.
Thank you once again. I think there's time for one or two more questions. So at the end, you were talking about the mergers and acquisitions. So one question is, what would happen to me as an exporter if the company where I supply to is acquired by a bigger company?
Okay. Yeah. Most companies are acquired to grow their business and take a bigger market share. So what I've said earlier is to expand their market reach, or to increase their portfolio, or to gain access to raw material. And they cannot do this without having enough materials, and therefore an acquisition can mean also an increase of demand. The best is, of course, to understand effect and needs of your buyers, and to keep also in close contact with them, because usually also the management of the company remains the same, especially for the seafood sector. So usually the management of the seafood division of a company stays the same. So it's best to really contact the company, or the buyer, for example.
I think the key thing there is to determine whether the sourcing department, whether that stays the same, or there's new people that you need to familiarize yourself with and target them.
So
And thank you. Sorry, Mariska. Oh, Sophie, go ahead.
Yes, so basically just being in contact with your supplier, with your importer is really, because it is really important. Because anyway, if there are any new companies that I mean, for example, if there would be a change in the system, then they would need to, of course, inform you what the impact is for your company. And also what would be the impact in the longer term. So best to communicate with importer.
Thank you once again. So a couple of questions came in, but we are not very sure if they have all been answered through our system. Some were answered by chat, but we are not 100% sure. So what we will do is we will check at the end of the webinar, and any questions that were not yet answered, we will make sure to answer them by email. So I hope then, yeah, everybody has got what they were looking for. Yeah, maybe then now I can tell a little bit more about CBI's market information. Sophia already referred to it a couple of times, Mariska as well, of course. What we do as CBI, we offer free market information, free market research for different sectors, so including the fish and seafood sector. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, this is specifically aimed at exporters from developing countries. We have market studies that were the starting point for this webinar about demand for your products and the trends on the European market. But we have a lot more. We also have studies about requirements for your products. So what kind of legal requirements, but also buyer requirements, preferences that you need to fulfill if you want to export to Europe. Also, we have studies with tips on how to find buyers and how to do business in Europe, and a study providing tips on how to practically organize your exports. It was already mentioned, we now have a new study, but it's not yet on this slide, about digitalization. What role does digital services play in the whole fish and seafood export? So these are all studies on sector level, but we also have studies on product level. About specific species like tuna or different type of shrimp, for example. Well, in order to stay up to date on our latest publications and our future events, you can sign up for our monthly market intelligence newsletter. One event that I want to mention also is I think it was in the part about the trends, about traceability, the role of the European Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy, or the sea to plate strategy that the European Union is developing. And at the end of October, beginning of November, we have two webinars about the impact of this European Green Deal for the different sectors that CBI works in. So please keep an eye also on our website, on the event page of our website, and there you can register for this webinar. So I think we have come to the end of this webinar now. Once again, I would like to thank our speakers from Seafood Tip, Mariska and Sophia, for sharing all this information with us. We will share with you as an audience also the recording of this webinar and the presentation. Lastly, I would like to thank you, our audience, for attending. Please let us know if you find this webinar useful and if you have any feedback to us by filling the survey that is coming up as soon as this webinar ends. So on behalf of CBI, I would like to wish you a very good day and good luck with exporting your fish and seafood products to the European markets. Thank you very much, and see you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.